Good morning. My name is Steve Koleno, and before we begin, I want to note that the observations and perspectives shared throughout this presentation are confidential remarks intended for discussion purposes only. This presentation examines what happens when a major regulatory change collides with deeply embedded economic incentives. The settlement was designed to increase transparency, expose commissions, and create greater buyer choice. Yet almost immediately, a new vocabulary emerged around the same economic objective. What we're looking at is not simply a compliance story, it's a story about adaptation. It's about how industries respond when long-standing revenue structures are challenged. The language changes, the framing changes, the labels change, but often the underlying incentives remain remarkably consistent. As we move through this discussion, I want you to focus less on the words themselves and more on what those words are designed to accomplish. This highlights the gap between regulatory intent and market behavior. The settlement's objective was straightforward. It sought to unbundle commissions, remove automatic compensation structures, and create more direct negotiation between buyers and agents. In theory, this would increase transparency and give consumers greater leverage over the services they receive and the fees they pay, but markets rarely remain static when incentives are disrupted. What we saw instead was a rapid adaptation process. Rather than eliminating the commission conversation, many organizations repositioned it. New terminology emerged, new forms appeared, new explanations were introduced. What had previously been viewed as compensation agreements were increasingly framed as consumer protections and safeguards. The important takeaway is that the structural reform was real. The rules changed. However, the industry's ability to absorb that change and repackage it into a more acceptable narrative happened even faster. One of the most revealing aspects of any major industry transition is the difference between public messaging and economic function. Publicly, the language sounds reassuring. We hear phrases like, "We're protecting buyers now," "Everything is in writing for transparency," or "It's required under the new rules." Each statement sounds reasonable on its own. In many cases, portions of those statements are factually correct. However, when we examine the economic mechanics underneath, a different picture emerges. The practical effect is often to secure compensation commitments earlier in the relationship, before the consumer has fully experienced the value being offered. What matters here is not whether the language is technically accurate. What matters is understanding the role the language plays. Language shapes perception. Perception influences decisions. And decisions ultimately determine economic outcomes. The central question is not what is being said. The central question is what the language is designed to achieve. This shows a process that has become increasingly common in post-settlement environments. Step 1 occurs very early in the relationship, before meaningful engagement takes place. The buyer is introduced to documentation and procedural requirements. The timing is important because it occurs before substantial value has been demonstrated. Step 2 involves the deployment of a carefully constructed narrative. The discussion is framed around protection, compliance, legal requirements, and consumer benefit. These concepts create legitimacy and reduce resistance. Step 3 is the signature itself. Once the agreement is executed, uncertainty is reduced for the service provider, and the compensation structure becomes significantly more predictable. Viewed individually, each step appears logical. Viewed collectively, they create a system that restores much of the certainty that regulatory reform was designed to challenge. This is why understanding process is often more important than understanding policy alone. To understand the industry's response, we need to understand the threat it was responding to. The settlement introduced uncertainty into a revenue model that had been stable for decades. Compensation that was once assumed now required more negotiation, more explanation, and potentially more competition. From an economic perspective, that represents a significant disruption. The response we observed was not necessarily driven by malice or bad intentions. It was driven by predictability. Businesses seek stability, organizations seek revenue certainty. Professionals seek to reduce risk. When viewed through that lens, the rapid adoption of compensation agreements makes perfect sense. The objective becomes restoring the certainty that the settlement removed. Understanding incentives allows us to move beyond emotion and focus on behavior. Incentives explain far more than intentions ever will. This focuses on timing. The regulatory goal was to create leverage for buyers during the period when meaningful decisions are being made. That leverage was intended to exist during home viewings, negotiations, and discussions about value and compensation. However, if compensation commitments are established at the very beginning of the relationship, the leverage dynamic changes. The consumer is now making an economic commitment before fully evaluating the service, before comparing alternatives, and before understanding the actual value delivered. This is what the slide refers to as the kitchen table moment. It's the point where a commitment is requested before experience has had a chance to inform judgment. Whether one agrees with that approach or not, it fundamentally changes where negotiation occurs and who holds leverage during the process. The final slide brings everything together. Regulatory systems can change rules. They can modify procedures. They can introduce new requirements and eliminate old ones. What they cannot easily change are incentives. When incentives remain intact, organizations adapt. New language emerges. New processes emerge. New compliance frameworks emerge. The outward appearance changes while the underlying economic objective seeks to reestablish itself. That is the cycle illustrated here. A rule is introduced. Revenue is threatened. Language is rebranded. Incentives are secured again, and the process repeats. The larger lesson extends far beyond real estate. It applies to nearly every regulated industry. If we want to understand behavior, we must look beyond policy and examine incentives, because a rule change does not automatically eliminate an incentive. More often, it teaches that incentive a new vocabulary. Thank you for your time and attention. This has been Confidential Remarks.